bright sunny day.
Oh my gosh, we're washed out here. What is that? Here, go turn on the light.
That's all right. Well, welcome to the Smarten Up show. We have bright, shiny people.
I know.
It's okay. You can leave the window open. Like the no.
Turn on this light here.
All right. Well.
Yeah, see there.
Oh.
It's okay.
I feel a little dark. I don't know. Okay, just a moment. We are, you're more reflective than I am.
Well, I do reflect more than you.
Excuse me in the camera there because, Joe made it dark.
I'm more contemplative than you.
So speaking of light and darkness, well, we are happy to be with you to hopefully enlighten and
not darken.
Inform and not darken.
Not like the eclipse.
Right. We're still on about that eclipse. Yes. So you can find us on lamnetwork.tv, School Pods Canada Facebook page, and Smarten Up YouTube channel.
Yeah, subscribe to the channel. We do this every Tuesday, and you can catch all the past episodes. And although we might appear sometimes as if we don't know what we're talking about, I think you're really actually going to get some good information, and that will be helpful. That may be just my
great
opinion.
introduction, honey. Great introduction.
Going with what I have.
Right. So we really share with you our passion for, families and thriving families and education. We have homeschooled in the past. I have personally been a public school teacher, a Christian school teacher. And we often joke about that Daryl educates adults and I educate children, but there are a lot of similarities.
I educate the children in big bodies, is what we say.
Right. Well, and so when we talk about education, we always think about the children, but really, especially as a homeschooler, one thing I learned is that the adults learn alongside with the children. And actually today we've chosen a topic that really, I think it was through homeschooling that I learned to love this subject. It was not a subject I loved in school. And that's history. And there was a bit of a trauma. I had the most severe teacher and now going back, like I grew up in Eastern Europe. And so whenever when a teacher would ask a question, you could put your hand up, but usually we're chosen to stand up at the front of the class and give a full answer. So you were supposed to make sense, sound good, and actually know what you're talking about. And so that was really kind of traumatized me a little bit at the time. So I didn't like history. It was, spewing a bunch of facts and things that we were told. And so when I chose to be a teacher, I was nowhere in the history or culture kind of thing. I became a math and science teacher. So I never really had a passion for this, but as we were homeschooling, I've been able to pick up wonderful curriculums and through some research and trying to figure out how to present history to our son and then to all the School Pods kids that have come through our pod, I have found out that I became fascinated because...
Well, how could you not be interested in history when it is a recounting of what's happened? I mean, who doesn't want to know about what's happened in the past? Now, granted, there are people who can spoil it for you in the way that they convey it. I mean, I took a history course in my first and second year of university, and my teacher was monotone. He read most of his notes. He was not particularly engaging, but I mean...
And you've always been interested in history.
I love history.
So somebody like that had to kill it for you because you actually had interest.
Well, I mean, it didn't really kill it for me. It just didn't make it terribly appealing in that course. Once I got into the books and stuff like that, I was okay. But listening to him, I was just like, oh. But I also remember, I mean, you can do that. You can make anything interesting. You can make math interesting. You can make science. But I remember that back at university, I had a stats teacher, and he was this little short bald guy. He had glasses, he had a beard, and he stood up at the front, and there was probably about 200 of us in the class or something like that. And he would stand at the at the front there, and he talked like this,
Yeah.
and he would look up at the ceiling, and he would go blah 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 blah. And I remember there was one time, I had my hand up to ask a question. I felt like I was training for puppet school or something like that, because my hand was just standing, it was just up in the air. He wasn't even looking at me. And
Right.
you know what? I don't think I passed the course. I think I had to take it over again because I couldn't understand anything this guy was talking about. And turns out I actually like statistics.
Right. So yeah, absolutely. Sometimes it's the personalities, but most often we to make anything engaging, we have to really connect with the child and the person and their interests. And this is, I think, when they talk about child-led education, I don't mean the children decide on day-to-day basis what is to happen in education, but how is it to be approached, and the interests of the children to be incorporated. I That's what I understand under child led. Of course, children will ask questions, and obviously um, those questions could be incorporated into education, but
Hmm.
child led does not mean the children decide the curriculum for the school year.
Let's
And
learn about video games today.
oh
What
yeah.
did we do yesterday? Same thing we did.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because children are very much in the moment. Their lives are a limited experience, and so they want to learn about what's them before them right now. And so sometimes a child making connection with history is a difficult thing,
Yeah.
because they haven't. And this is what I was thinking. Why is it me as an adult all of a sudden am I becoming interested in history? Well, because my life is becoming history. A lot of things that I've liked as a child is becoming retro now. So you're becoming aware that there were real people in the past that, you know, we call history, but they were people just like us. And so you're
Yeah.
kind of starting to connect with older times and different times as the times are changing throughout your life.
Yeah.
But how do we get children engaged?
We start singing the Bruce Springsteen song, Glory Days.
Glory days, right? And so you're dating yourself just by saying what songs you listen to.
I know, that was from 1984.
So some songs nowadays are becoming like they're remixing them and they're
Yeah.
becoming popular again.
I know.
Well, but that is kind of what one of the examples how we say history repeats itself, right? History is cyclical, and you've kind of read a book on that.
Yeah, the book, the Fourth Turning by
I'll find out. Is it on your shelf back there? You
it
see,
is on my shelf.
we have reference library here, so whenever we talk to you about any topic, we can go.
Yeah, it's Neil Howe and William Strauss. And what they do is they talk about the cycles in history and how there's a generation. So a generation is about once every 20 to 25 years.
Right.
And you have this kind of theme, and they talk about the seasons. So there's four generations, four seasons. You got winter, spring, summer, fall.
Mhm.
And so winter is a time of cataclysm, usually war,
Conflict, yeah.
yeah.
It almost feels like we're walking into winter.
Well, and if you look at because the last one was what? It was World War II, and that
Yeah.
was 80 years ago. So you're right on track for another winter season.
Yeah.
And can you? So after the winter season, then you have the time of rebuilding, and so and then you have the time of success, and then you have the time of decline, and then after the time of decline, of course, is when you have conflict again. But you also have a corresponding generation and attitude of a generation, and so
And every generation responds to what the environment, the atmosphere that's been created by the previous one.
Yeah, exactly. And so a time of winter, of course, you have your heroic figures and whatnot. You have the time of, people like Winston Churchill rising up. In the springtime, when you have the rebuilding, it's the time of sacrifice. It's the time of mutual benefit. It's collectivism. It's,
Yeah.
sacrificing for the greater good. But once that's done, the next generation, and this would typify, of course, the baby boomers, is the summer generation, which is the time of leisure and excess. And that's where the attention turns back to self. Well, self sacrifice is no longer needed.
Well, so it's more like the self-actualization, like, and there's a lot of philosophies right now, like self-care and well-being, like looking at the self, and unfortunately that's created a little bit of individualism in our society.
Yeah.
And it is not a bad thing to really work on oneself to become a better person, but when the focus is too much that way, then we lose sight of
Yeah.
what's happening in our society.
Of course.
And this is where also we get, I guess, politically, now what happens is when we're not careful, we start losing freedoms again. And so I think we are at that stage
Yeah.
in history.
Yeah. And so we've definitely, and I think, probably 9/11 was really kind of the entrance into the new winter cycle, and they call it archetypes or epochs.
Right.
And so for the past 23 years, we have been in this winter cycle, and it's going to culminate, it looks like, now with the situation going on in the Middle East. Of course, we've also had the Russia-Ukraine war over the past
Yeah.
couple of years. But the problem is, of course, is that each time you arrive at a winter season, it gets worse because the technology is greater and the capacity for destruction is worse.
Right.
So,
Yeah, like deaths in World War I were fewer than the deaths in World War II.
well, World
And
War One was called the war to end all wars, and I think I can't remember the exact figure. Something like 10 million people died in that, and it was a brutal war. I mean, 4 years long, and and the conditions were horrendous. Well, not 20 years later, you get World War II, and no, 20 or 21 years later,
yeah, it's
when
not
World War
that
II
long
started.
after. Yeah.
No, very unusual. And in this case, over the 6 years that World War II lasted, it's estimated about 50 million people died.
Yeah. So we have increased, even though technology is increasing and protection, but also the harm that's being done is increased as
Well,
well.
and of course, you have the dynamic of the technology being used for evil, and so we saw what's happened with the past 4 years, and um,
Well, and actually a lot of the advance in science and technology was due to World War II, because there were
yeah,
some immoral, I guess, experiments being done during
oh
that
yeah,
time. And even so, now we have, was it the Nuremberg uh,
codes,
codes,
yes.
because of that, the envelope of morality being pushed so
Well,
far.
and the essence of the Nuremberg codes
Yeah.
was is that you couldn't do something to someone's body medically without having their permission, which we completely tossed out the window with
During
COVID.
COVID.
I mean,
So
everybody just said, "Well, about that Nuremberg, don't worry
well,
about it."
but because I think we're so far removed from that time now
Yeah,
that it's no longer
right.
so fresh in our minds. And this is why, when I was even looking at different articles, why teach history to children? And one of the big reasons is, we need to teach our children to learn from other people's mistakes, so that they don't have to make all the mistakes they need to learn.
Well, Spanish American philosopher George Santayana said, "Those who don't learn from history um, are doomed to repeat, or those who don't learn from the past." I think was what he actually said. There's been many, many variations,
Yeah.
but those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
And the problem is that we don't want to learn. See, knowledge is learning from your own mistakes. Wisdom is learning from someone else's mistakes. And it's always much easier to look at what other people did and say, you know what, it's probably not a good idea that we do that.
Well, and wisdom is also knowledge applied, because you
Right.
can know that something's good or bad, but then if you don't exercise that on in your decision making process, then it's not wisdom.
Yeah.
And that's why we're so surprised that people who are educated and people who have had success in the past, they're somewhere they fail to make a good decision,
Yeah.
right? And that is because they don't always choose to take the knowledge that they have.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to kind of read through, um, So as I said, um, I was never passionate about history, but as I was started teaching it to young children, and I guess being a parent now and an educator, I feel responsible to passing on information to the next generation. Before I had children, I looked at it differently,
Yeah.
because it was me in the world and my generation was coming up. But now my generation has children and we're raising the next generation,
Mhm.
and what we teach our children is a big responsibility when it comes to history. And also because history is really a warning
Mhm.
for the future as well.
100%. So yesterday was a significant day in history, and that
Oh, yes.
in 1912, yesterday commemorated the sinking of the Titanic,
Yes.
and that was the most infamous, I guess, maritime disaster in history. Although not the largest loss of life, there was something about the Titanic, and even growing up, I remember because, um,
Like
and
children, I think throughout history, like since then, have been fascinated by the Titanic.
well, yeah,
The world's been
yeah,
fascinated
I
by
mean, I
it.
remember, and I
Yeah.
remember the year that they found it in 1985. I remember I used to deliver newspapers as a kid,
Yes.
and every once in a while there would be an article that come out and said, "Oh, we think we may have found, or
Yeah. People have
clues
been searching for it
searching for the Titanic."
70 something years until they found the Titanic.
Yeah, almost 70 years, or actually over 73 years.
Yeah.
And I remember when they did find it. I mean, I bought a couple of books, um, and there's a mystique about it
Yeah.
because of,
They still don't know what truly happened. There's a lot of ideas and a lot of theories, but it's just when you take a boat that was called the Titanic was called the unsinkable boat, and how disastrous it ended up,
yeah,
people are fascinated. What went wrong? I mean, people can't help but ask the question.
right. I mean, it was the most luxurious ship in the world at the time. um, they were explaining what the tickets cost, and first class tickets in today's dollars would have been what, $60,000 or something like that.
Something, yeah, around that.
And there are lots of conspiracies, of course, regarding what happened. We do know that three of the men who died, it was Benjamin Guggenheim, um,
Seems like a
Walter
famous
Strauss. Well, there
family.
were there were
Yeah.
three men in, industrialists, high financiers, and interestingly enough, all three of them were against the creation of the Federal Reserve. Um,
So yeah, when we look at history, that's why we need to look at history from different sources and different
yeah,
perspectives and points of view. And that's why firsthand accounts, like people who were part of it, it's important, because as you dig from the different perspectives,
mhm.
you will find different significance and connection to something else that was going on at the
Right,
time.
exactly, because the following year in 1913 was the creation of the Federal Reserve, which is, of course, a central bank. Now, the US had already had two central banks, and both of them were put mercifully out of everybody else's misery. And as a matter of fact, Andrew Jackson, he ran for president based on the premise that he was going to get rid of the central bank because he knew how destructive they could be. Well, then you have the creation of the reserve at Jekyll Island in 1913, and look at the mess that we're in today because of it. Most wars are started over money and power, and so
Yes.
you look at what happened with the Titanic. How is it that, and it was the press. It wasn't the White Star Line that owned the Titanic, but
Mhm.
it was the press that said the ship that God Himself couldn't sink. You never want to be making statements like that.
Well, and that's the other thing throughout history. I mean, people have a lot of achievements, but yeah, when we get a little bit
That's called hubris.
proud.
Pride comes before destruction. The haughty
Yes.
look before a fall.
So that's what happens. But also, I've been showing the kids some kind of snippets and documentaries, and there was a lot of neglect that happened in the preparation of the Titanic. Like
Sure.
they never ran safety drills,
Mhm.
and for cosmetic purposes, because they didn't put enough
Lifeboats.
lifeboats in there because it would have been too crowded, and the scenery would have been you know um, obscured.
Mm. Yeah, it would have
Yeah,
been, cluttered and everything else.
cluttered, and so So there were a lot of frivolous decisions being made because of that pride, because but who knows? Like we don't know. And that's the thing. This is why we have to pair history with critical thinking,
Hmm.
training for our children and looking at different perspectives. And so when I looked up, I Googled up, why should we teach history to our children? I'm just going to read a passage here from this one article. So, history provides identity and shows us models of good and responsible behavior. Oh, no, the previous paragraph. So, history not only provides us with nostalgic glimpse of how things used to be. And I know when we were talking about Titanic, the kids were like, wow, that sounds like a place I want to go to. We're talking about the heated pool and the food and all. They had ice cream on board and the kids were excited about that. The things
Yeah, and you can go
that
on any cruise ship and get those things now. I mean, you look at some of the biggest ships in the world. Actually, it was interesting. There was someone who, I can't remember who it was, but they had contrasted the size of the Titanic with the largest ships in the world today.
and it's
And
not that big. It was
and
only like two and a half, three football fields long. Like it
well,
wasn't
it
that.
was over 800 feet. But if you look at the size of like the Carnival Cruise Line ships today,
Yeah.
and they're like 17 stories high. They're as tall as apartment buildings. They absolutely would have dwarfed the Titanic, which was the longest ship in the world at the time.
And yeah, that fascinates us. So, but for the time, the Titanic represented prestige, represented advancement in technology, represented a lot of things that people were striving
It
for.
was the fastest ship in the world, the fastest cruise liner in the world at the time, I think.
So I'm not sure. Like there were so many details we've gone over.
Yeah.
So the history does give us a little bit of nostalgia. I mean, like Greece, probably Greek people love reading about Greece and the ancient Greece and philosophy, and then China when it was a great nation, and you know what I mean. Like, there's some nostalgia, and which comes also with identity.
Yeah.
All these countries, all these nations have an identity in their past. So anyway, it gives a glimpse of how things used to be, but it's also a lesson that can teach us things that are important for life today. History can be the richest of all stories and the saddest of stories and the most shocking of stories. It is a story of all people in all places at all times. And because we know the history, we can decide what may happen in the future. So history also, because of watching patterns in history, like you spoke about this book, we
Mhm.
can start predicting where we're heading next. Because human nature doesn't change throughout history. It's just the circumstances change, but we
Well,
react
and
similarly to
there's
them.
the human spirit works in cycles too. And so there's a reason why God made things the way that he did, in that we go through seasons. That's why we have 1 year, 365 days. That's why we have the weekly cycle. That's why we have the
Yeah.
monthly cycles. So history is not linear. It doesn't go in a straight line, but it also isn't like the new age where, you just go in circles and you like reincarnation almost. History does move forward, but it does so in cycles. And so,
Cyclically going forward.
right.
Like
So it's
yes.
almost like a tumbleweed or a pinwheel or something like that.
There you go. So history moves like a tumbleweed.
Right. And they've even done studies which show that if people have like a particular trauma, and it happened at a certain time of year, when that time of year comes
Yeah.
back again, people will experience
Seasonal triggers. Yeah.
depression
Yeah.
or something, or it could be the opposite. It could be euphoria.
Joys and
Yeah.
I'm
It's,
happy. I don't know why.
the day that you got married, it's an exciting time. For a lot of people that's exciting. For some people not, but it depends.
For us, it is.
Yes.
We'll leave it at that, right?
Absolutely.
Because we're now together talking.
Right.
All right. So just a little bit more about why I teach history. It provides identity and shows us models of good and responsible behavior. And I think that is the main reason I enjoy history right now,
Mhm.
because it really talks about based on what decisions were made and how. And then I've been teaching Canadian history in our pod, and how most of the decisions were made because they wanted land, wanted wealth, and they wanted power. I mean, that's probably most of history that's true for. And
Yep.
and how different alliances and things were made, and and how others felt when like it's just how everybody was impacted because of these things. And so morality is very important as you watch how history was handled.
Yeah.
And so it says, so it teaches us how to learn from the mistakes of others. The history helps us understand how society can change and develop. If we don't teach our children to connect with history, then the consequences for our society could be disastrous.
Mhm.
And the more we know about the past, the better prepared we are for the future, because we become, by remembering the past, we realize that we are responsible for building legacy for the generations that follow us. And I think that's what I just said when we started the show. I think, to me, history has become more important because I'm preparing the next generation of decision makers, of those who are going to shape history
Well,
then.
and history is fascinating. If you watch historical fiction, like documentaries and stuff like that, just learning about different things that happened in the past. You put the right spin on me. History is absolutely fascinating. They often talk about truth is stranger than fiction,
Yeah,
and
it's
that
true.
if you read the accounts of some of the things that have happened throughout history, it's like you couldn't make this stuff up.
Yeah, like even when we speak about the Titanic, who could have made a story like that if
Yeah.
that hadn't happened, and all the details of how it happened? It's amazing
Hmm.
to study that.
And then they had a big movie about that, and
Well, originally there was a movie made that became instant hit not long after the Titanic sank, but Leonardo DiCaprio made it popular again
it's,
for
it's
our
how he
generation.
got his start.
Absolutely. So, and this is like you mentioned that. So how do we make history fun for children? Spewing facts at them with monotone voice is not the way.
No,
And so because our son, he's like you, I guess, he's fascinated by history and historical things. We have found some historical fiction children's series, and that's what educators recommend. Start with historical fiction, and
mhm.
usually it's like kids like their age going in the past. They time travel somehow and interact with the characters, the historic characters. And so we've had series like the Magic Tree House.
Mhm.
So kids travel
Miss
to,
Frizzle
well, no, that's the
meant
Magic
school
School Bus.
bus. Oh,
That's
sorry.
science. That's we're gonna do another show. I know. So, so the Magic School Bus is the Magic Tree
Treehouse.
House. Okay, don't now you got me thinking about something else. And there's also the I Survive series. Our
Mm.
son loves, now he's
Oh,
fascinated by disasters in the past, and they talk about so through the point of view of a child that has lived at the time when the certain disaster
yeah.
happened, and a whole story happens. Um, Gosh, there are other things, but he loves historic fiction.
Mhm.
And so I think reading out loud as a family, because you know what? Um, Even though children are into video games and all that, if you put everything away and start reading a well-written book,
Mhm.
they get right into it
Oh,
because
yeah.
they're still full of imagination. And so they can picture themselves in the story. And
Mhm.
so that's how they can connect to the historic period that you're learning about.
And Yossi also has a series called Horrible Histories.
Oh, how did I forget that? It's
Um,
called Horrible
I don't
Histories.
know, but it goes through the different ages, and so you'll have um, and it's always alliteration. So it's the
Amazing Aztecs
yeah,
and the Gregorious Greeks or something
yeah,
like that.
and the
Like
rambunctious Romans, and
I don't know. And like no, it's not the real titles. We're just kind of giving you examples. But
yeah.
so yes, the Horrible Histories, and I would recommend this actually for boys because there are a few facts in there that are kind of like gross and a little bit like not pleasant, but boys go, yeah, there was blood and guts, yay, that was great, So
Yeah,
again,
vicious Vikings,
yeah,
and
vicious like, oh yeah, and like it's just
so then he'll come running up to me and say, did you know? And he'll talk about this, horrendous method of torture that they had and stuff like
but
that.
it's amazing how many things he retains, because when we learn, if there's some emotion, if
Yep.
there is something like imagination being engaged and all that, we'll remember these facts.
Well, and I have a personal testimony about that. That I always had this fascination with martial arts growing up. I mean, my father, we grew up in the '70s, so my brother and I, we would go to. My dad would take us to all these Chuck Norris movies, and we loved them because what boy doesn't like Bruce Lee's favorite drink. Um, So, but where did that come from? And then I remember when I was in like grade 6 or something like that. And one of the things that I had always said is that I'd never seen the movie Enter the Dragon, and that is kind of like the martial arts movie of all time. It doesn't matter how many are made after that. That will always be the standard for the genre. And so eventually, this friend of mine and I, we ended up going, and we watched the first movie. It was Jackie Chan movie. And then the second movie was Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee. And I'm watching it and watching it. And all of a sudden there was this one scene, probably about 2/3 the way through. And then I got a flashback. And the memory that came to me was my father and I walking hand in hand. And I was 4 years old because it was when the movie came out in 1973. And we're walking hand in hand to the movie theater. And I was like, oh, I've seen this before. And it was, and I don't know how I got in to see that movie at 4 years old. I mean, you watch it now, and you wouldn't be allowed. A 4-year-old would not be allowed in to watch it now.
Yeah, we didn't have the same restrictions.
No, we didn't. But that experience always developed a fascination for me for martial arts. I started taking it when I was 16, and to this day, I love watching those movies and training myself. So it was that imprint of that one experience that transformed everything for me.
Yeah, and so
so the point is if you make something enjoyable at an impressionable age, you will develop a lifelong experience and joy for them in that.
So other things other than historic fiction books, there's also movies, and we mentioned the Titanic and so forth. They kind of rekindled the fascination.
Yeah.
Because movies are usually dramatic, and so you can connect with the characters, and the people who were a part of that historic event become real to you.
Yeah.
So there's movies. I would say going to historic sites. I mean, we lived in the Niagara region. There are a lot of forts around here because we're on the border of the United States.
Right.
And so you can go visit with historic reenactments. You can go to pioneer villages. It's so good to put the children in that environment, immerse them completely into the historic.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. I mean, I remember, going to Fort York in Toronto when I was younger. They would have mock battles where people would be dressed up in costumes, and you would want to know about this stuff. I mean, you would retain so much other than reading it dryly in a book and going,
well, like if it's a factoid book, right? But if it's like something more exciting and fascinating, and so that's why I even I use several resources to do like. I remember when we were studying the fur trade, the beginning of the fur trade here in North America, and so I did a game with the kids. We had the resources, and I put them around the house. The different things that they find, and they had to trade it with each other, and there were certain rules they had to follow. And I remember we had very competitive kids last year when I did that. And there was one that, grabbed all the resources. So he had this strategy. Everybody was like, and then they were starting to run out of resources. And the person who grabbed them first, they're like, I don't want to trade with you. I don't want, I want to have this stuff.
Starve.
Well, that's how it was. And there was a lot of frustration. But you know what? Because of that frustration they experienced, then we talked about why were there conflicts between the different groups, the French and the British and the Native, and how the alliances were made and why they did those to help one another. So it really helped. And even though they were frustrated, it's really stuck.
Well, and if you look back in history, some of the settlers, they really ticked off the natives. And there's one story where they
just took their land. They're like, we're moving here.
Well, they didn't treat them very well. And so the natives said, really? And so what they ended up doing is they essentially starved them out. And there's stories of them
Now,
having to resort to
there
cannibalism and
is
stuff like that.
but there's the negative aspect, but there's the positive where the native people and the settlers were helping one another.
Yeah. Well,
Helping each other.
that was the pilgrims.
Helping each other cultivate the land and knowing what plants and animals were beneficial. I mean, we owe a lot to one another. So there's always positives and negatives in
Yeah.
history, and just being able to recreate that in a lesson or an experience, it really helps. And I know that I'm excited now to learn history because of these things, because I'm trying to make a connection. And then I see the situations from the past in my life today. And so I just wanted to go over some resources as well that I use, because as a homeschooler, so we've homeschooled for like 80 years now. And I know one of the complaints of a lot of Canadians, well, a lot of the curriculum is American. And it's true. There are a lot more, well, the population of the United States is bigger than Canadian population.
It's almost 10 times.
And there's a lot more homeschoolers in the United States. So a lot more of the curriculums are available, but that's changing. And I would urge Canadians to go to the Canadian homeschooler, Lisa Marie Fletcher. She actually has developed her own Canadian history curriculum. And she also promotes, we have a lady called Donna Ward, and she specializes in social studies. So she's a resource for people like me who were not fascinated by history. And I'm starting to learn history with my child.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of resources of teaching history through Canadian perspective, because again, we want to teach it through the perspective of the nation that you're part of. But at the same time, our history, the Canadian history, is so intertwined with the U.S. history,
Yeah.
and really with Europe. We also, I mean, the first settlers that came after the indigenous people were the Europeans, right? And so we're talking about how the Spanish, the British, and the French were really in this age of exploration, and they fought over territory. And that's why we speak English, French, and Spanish in a lot of the countries around the world, because of that colonization and exploration. So
then you throw the Dutch and the Portuguese in there.
Well, the Dutch, yeah, they came in as well. And so there's a whole dynamic when the settlement and those cultural backgrounds came into play. And so it's really, really amazing how the interaction happened here. But why bother teaching Canadian history anyway? Because when I came, I have to confess, when I came to Canada from Bulgaria, and in Europe, any of the country's history is like over 1,000 years old. Like a lot of the countries are old countries, and I come to a country that's just over 100 years old.
Yeah, I mean, I was just reading in the Bible this morning about Paul saying that he needs to go to Spain, written 2,000 years ago.
Right. So there's thousands of years of history in Europe where it come from, and so I'm coming to Canada, I'm like, well, what, how can you stretch 100 years of history over whatever courses that you have to take? And it was a little boring in school, and I didn't like it. And I kind of fit into this stereotype that people say, "Oh, Canadian history is boring." No, it's not.
No history is boring.
Yeah.
I mean, in order for a country to develop, if you understand human nature, that there's always conflict, there's always striving, there's always, we live in a country, or we live in a world where bad things always happen. So you have testimonies about overcoming.
Yeah.
If you look at Canadian history and you go back to World War One, Canadians were revered during World War One. You go to the Battle of Ypres, and so a lot of these battles happen in France.
Yeah.
And so, and Canada was a very young country at the time. We were like 40 years old.
Yeah.
And yet we stood out because of the valor and because of the heroism. Today in Holland, every year, the Netherlands gives, hundreds of thousands, millions of flowers, tulips, to Canada, because it was the Canadians who liberated the Netherlands from the Nazis during World War II. So to say that it's boring, and that's only, Canada was established as a country officially in 1867, but what about the colonization? What about the hundreds of
Well,
years
what
of
happened? Yeah,
settlements?
like it was a lot of years of exploration and attempts to settle, and the fur trade was the first. I mean, really, originally, people would come here to the east coast of Canada and the United States for natural resources,
Yeah,
because
tillage land.
because Europe, the population was numerous there, and they were starting to run out of resources and land and different things. So drove people to start exploring other lands to bring
Right.
resources from. And so, but eventually they said, well, why don't we just come and live here? Because, well, we don't like the way the government treats us or the religious, beliefs or whatever. We want to be free. So it's beautiful what has happened. So no, history is not boring, but also it talks about, like, if you think about it, if you had that opportunity, what would you do? And we talked about the fact that they came here and they had to ask the government to give them tools so that they can make their own homes. And the British government first, gave some of the first, actually it was the loyalists that came from the southern parts. They just gave them tents and just a few tools, but not nearly what they needed. So there's a lot of overcoming and hardship and being very resilient to the
Yeah, and
hardships.
that just shows you right there, you can't rely on the government for anything.
Well, it's always been that way. So, but and
And this
so
is not a political show. We're just, we're
but
just saying.
but the thing is, yeah, and we have come to rely on our government, and I think people need to remember in history that really who is in the best interest is the people coming together and making decisions and using their numbers to win their freedoms back. So
Mhm.
definitely in today's political scene, learning that history really got me inspired, because it's like, and even our son was saying the Boston Tea Party happened over 2% tax. We should be like having a war right now for how much tax we're paying here in
We need
Canada.
about 20 wars right now with what we're paying.
Well, but you see, that's the thing, because over time we get used to seeing things certain ways. So when you look back in history, it's like, that wasn't acceptable at a time. Why are we accepting it today?
Those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And the reason why the uh, Banking Act of 1913 was established, even though they had gotten rid of two central banks beforehand, was because people forgot.
Yeah.
And they were asleep at the wheel. And so what happens is you've got forces that are always, always, always there to take away your freedoms. There are always people in the world that want to take away your freedoms, control you. And if we don't
Yeah.
know their type, you see, the Bible also, Paul talks to the Corinthians. He says, "We're not ignorant of the devil's schemes."
Mm.
But if we don't learn history, then we will be ignorant of a scheme. Because, listen, uh, the tactics that they use don't really differ.
No.
Everything that happened during COVID over the past 4 years, the tactics weren't really new. Technology is obviously a lot different, and they were able to use the mass media and everything else in order to generate the fear that was necessary. But lockdowns have happened before, so this is just
Mm.
history repeating itself again.
Well, and the thing is, in order for us to create free, independent thinkers, we have to introduce children to all those decisions that have to be made in the past, and so that they could be citizens of their country who honor the history. And this is why I'm going to repeat that teaching history gives you a sense of cultural identity. I think we have lost our pride in even being Canadian,
Mhm.
and I think we need to once more see our country for what it was created to be, so that we can strive to continue doing that in our current time and in the future.
Mhm.
So we need to have some sense of national pride instead of giving up and saying, oh, what's the use? No, there's a lot of historic precedent that we can follow
Mhm.
if we study history, and also how they resolve the issues.
Yeah.
Like sometimes we forget, and we need to look into that.
Mhm.
um sometimes history gives us appreciation for the way things are today. I mean, what it took for Canada to be such a great country, and well off like today, and why we should fight not to lose that.
And it only took one World Economic Forum puppet 8 years to destroy all that.
I know. So definitely people need to regain the perspective. So that's why I'm speaking to the adults and the parents right now. We need to remember our history in order for us to pass on that passion and national pride to our children so that
Well,
they could make this country
yeah, and that's, that
good.
is a major component of totalitarian control, is that you remove education from people. When Pol Pot took over Cambodia, the first people that he went after were the intellectuals. As a matter of fact, if you had glasses, you were considered to be an intellectual, and they killed you. I mean, it was
Yeah.
insane. But what they want is they want a compliant and dumbed down population. That's why it was illegal to teach your slaves to read in the United States. So when they had the black slavery,
Yes.
it was actually against the law to teach a slave to read, and that's why Frederick Douglass is such an inspiration, because he learned to read, he started to study, and then he realized that, wait a minute, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. And when he escaped, he dedicated his entire life to helping and help create the along with what was her name, who developed the Underground Railroad? Harriet.
Harriet Tubman.
Yeah,
Okay.
Harriet Tubman. So
Mm,
Frederick Douglass was
right.
instrumental in that as well.
Well, and I just wanted to go to the next point because you kind of touched on that, is that studying history is not just about ourselves, and a big part of it is, yes, retaining our independence and our freedoms, but it's also gaining like developing compassion and understanding of the different groups that make up our society, like what the black people, like the African community had to go through
Mhm.
to come to Canada to gain their freedom because of the way they were treated. And even the children I was teaching in the pod, it was interesting because the first American colonies were all about independence, having freedom and independence, but then they had slavery at the same time.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of, and so studying that, how come you're fighting for freedom, but then these people are not being free, creates compassion. So understanding what different cultural groups within our society had to go through in order to, and so one of the values in Canada is to not have slavery.
Yep. Well,
And
and it was Wilberforce in England, and he was a member of Parliament for 44 years, and he constantly, for his 44-year career, advocated for the abolition of slavery. I mean, he was driving people crazy. Well, to understand, when you read about that, when you what do you call it? When you study that, you understand what it took in order to overthrow that system.
well, yeah, so it gives you appreciation for those people
Yeah.
who really stood by their convictions to change history and to influence our society. And so, speaking of which, the reason we also teach history is so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past.
And that's exactly
Hopefully.
what Santayana was saying. If you don't learn from the past, you will repeat it, because the enemy is going to use the same tactic over and over again as long as it works.
Yeah.
Once you thwart him, it's when Yeshua was tempted in the desert, and every time the temptation came, he refuted it with scripture. And so what the devil had to do is he had to come back at him with a different tactic. But as long as the same tactic works over, and he doesn't have to change anything.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we definitely have to remember that history is important. And I'm speaking to myself this because I didn't think it was until I started teaching my son and the next generation.
Mhm.
Um, Looking for primary sources and evidence. I know that there's a project in Israel that they um, interview a lot of Holocaust survivors because there's now even denial of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
in certain parts of the world. I'm not going to get you started on that. I'm just saying that history could be denied also if there's no evidence of what people
Well,
have gone
yeah,
through.
and it was sure. The door's open the entire time, and the
Excuse
moment I
me.
close it, and it was no, it was Eisenhower, um, and when they came into Germany and they liberated the concentration camps, and I think it was Auschwitz, if I'm not mistaken. But he said that they needed to take pictures because what he essentially said is that some SOB in the future is going to deny that this ever happened.
Well, because some, like you said, sometimes reality is stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
And so sometimes there's these experiences in history they're so extreme that you're like, if I didn't see it with my eyes, I only read about it, I wouldn't believe it. So
Yeah.
I need to have that firsthand evidence to
Yeah.
pass on to generations.
And so that's why when you have
Yeah.
Holocaust deniers now, they're denying reality is what they are.
Yeah.
And this has caused a lot of the issues in the world, with Israel now, and why Israel continues to get vilified for what they do, because you have, well, anti-Semitism is a spiritual disease, number one, because it's not rational. But number two, they're saying that they don't really have any right to defend themselves and things like that, and saying that what happened to them didn't really happen.
Well, and so that's another reason to study history is that societies always change. There's always change, but it changes in a specific way. So we need to also learn cause and consequences
Yeah.
of history, because it doesn't change randomly. There's this very specific reason why history changes the way it does and in
Yeah.
what direction it goes. We need to see history from different perspectives. We need to develop ethics. I think history, if anything it teaches us, is the importance of ethics, because of some of the big disasters that happened in the past is
Yeah.
when we suspended ethics. And we decided that, one group decided that they have rights over another group, or like, it's just, there's just so much richness
Yeah.
in history. So just before we start wrapping this up, what we need to do as parents who teach our children history is we need to be passionate about it ourselves first.
Yes.
We need to, and I know I had to shed my indifference and my kind of mockery of how Canadian history was not really eventful. It was. Start digging a little bit, and it was. But it doesn't matter where in the world you are. So we have to role model this positive engagement in social, like, events and things that are happening right now, because we need to remember that our engagement in our society right now determines the future. And having activities and doing things together, making it personal, being engaged and involved. So quickly, some of the resources are Donna Ward. She has great Canadian history and geography curriculum. There's different Canadian history task cards. I know modern history through Canadian eyes. I've also gone to, let me see. The Great Canadian Adventure is a monthly subscription program that sends you province by province history curriculum. So there's just so much time capsules and so forth. So I would urge you to incorporate that if you're homeschooling. And if you find that if your child's in school and you're not satisfied the way it's being taught, then make it a family vacation thing or a trip to go to a different historic site and to really actively learn about history. And so when holidays like this Monday, we had Titanic Remembrance Day, I jumped on that opportunity because you know what I said to myself? I want to know a little bit more about what happened. I don't want to kind of hear about it without investigating it myself. So this will create lifelong learners in your children.
And this is what makes the Bible so fascinating, is that a large portion of the Bible is history. You look at the book of Genesis and Exodus, it's really, the entire Torah is a lot of it is Israel's history. You have the book of First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, Chronicles. They're all historical books. Then you have the New Covenant. You have the Gospel accounts, the life of Yeshua. You have the Book of Acts, the life of the apostles. And what makes it separate from any other religious text is this historical stuff. The good, the bad, and the ugly. So there's a richness in studying history, and if we don't learn it, we are going to repeat it, and someone's always going to be able to take advantage of it. So,
as you were speaking about the Bible, though, when we went to Israel, our tour guide was an archaeologist, and he said they have taken the Bible and they have gone and done digs in the places the Bible says that things were happening. Indeed, they found. So he knows that the Bible is a historical text,
even though this guy's not a believer.
Well, but you know what? I think when we learn the facts, we will start developing and understanding more and more. So stay curious and learn together.
Yep. And smarten up.
Yes.
Thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.